Well, good morning. It's Friday. Glad to have you with us as we are reaching towards the end of this week of our journey looking through Jesus. And as we mentioned at the end of yesterday, ending with this Passover meal, that things were going to pick up speed and we're going to fly through a lot of different things today, trying to cover all that happened. Because remember, in the Jewish mindset, a day ran from sunset to sunset. So they actually partook of the Passover feast, the last meal, on the start of their Friday. It would have been after sunset, and then things rolled right along. So there was a lot that happened now here, technically on Friday, that began, say, in our Thursday night at 6 o'clock, going through the rest of the day. So here are just a few things that happened at the Passover meal, this Last Supper. There's just a lot of things that go on there. There's just a lot of teaching that Jesus spends a lot of time with his disciples, which is amazing things. And I want to highlight some of these things. We read that at that meal that he washed the disciples' feet. He showed them what servant leadership was all about and how he donned that cloth and washed their feet. It's also the time where Judas is identified as the one who is going to betray, and Judas leaves to go do that deed of betraying Jesus and going to get the chief priests and the army to go get him. Jesus also gives this new commandment. We're really picking up in John chapter 12 and 13 is where we're following the chronology of what John records. But in John 13, that's where Jesus gives this new commandment that he had spoken of, that we now remember as the new covenant, that we are to love one another. Love one another. And before it was love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, the greatest commandment. And the one that was like it was love your neighbor. And now Jesus says, love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. Matthew 13:35. He then goes to tell that he confronts Peter and says, Peter, you're going to deny me. He talks a lot of teaching, as I said earlier. He talks about how in his Father's house there are many mansions in John 14, that he was the way, the truth, and the life. No one would come to the Father but by him. He talks about the promise of the Holy Spirit that would come after him, who would be the one who would be with them and indwell them and give aid to them. He talked about how he was the true vine, and they were the branches in John chapter 15. He talked about how the world, because it hated him, it would hate them as his followers as well. He talked about the work of the Holy Spirit in John chapter 16, again, further communicating that. He talked about how he had overcome the world. And then, before he gets to the actual Garden of Gethsemane, he ends his time teaching the disciples by giving this high priestly prayer that we refer to, that we call it, in John chapter 17, where he, in their presence, I believe, as I look at this and just understand it, that in the presence of his disciples, Jesus, prayed for his disciples. And they heard him pray these prayers that we read so quickly sometimes in John chapter 17. And he prays for his disciples, and then he prays for those who would believe because of the disciples' testimony.
Us.
Jesus prayed for us. Mm-hmm. And that's an amazing, amazing thing. And I think what is so keen and so important about this section is that Jesus, in his last moments, before he's arrested, before he's put on trial, before he's crucified, he's spending these last hours with the ones he loved the most, the ones he spent the most time with. And John 18 begins with this idea that when Jesus had spoken all these words, then he went out with his disciples, and they went across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered, and that's where he prayed, and he spent that last time with his disciples there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And remember, Jesus asked them to stay awake. But if we're looking at a time frame, if sunset was 6 o'clock at night and they had their meal and they had all these teachings, there are some who would estimate that they did not get to the Garden of Gethsemane until after 11 p.m. And so it was a late night. And so we fault the disciples for falling asleep, but it was a late night. We have trouble staying up that late anymore. So this is where the disciples find themselves. And then again, more of these events start to roll right along. So they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, probably getting there around 11 o'clock at night, and then multiple things start to happen from there.
Right. So we've been reading this little book by Chuck Swindoll called Behold the Man. And he just really kind of breaks it down succinctly what happened the rest of that night. And it's so interesting. A chronology of events that starts about 1 in the morning, where Jesus is in prayer and agony at Gethsemane. And by 1:30, there's the betrayal by Judas, and they come to arrest Jesus. At 2 a.m., the first trial, and then one trial after the next, all the way to about 7:30 in the morning. And this is the first time for me I've really noticed the fact that it happened all night long. Like, they were awake. There were, the Pharisees and the religious leaders were trying to slide this thing through. They were trying to, like you said yesterday, in stealth, get rid of Jesus. When they've got the Passover that they're trying to work around and
the fear of the people.
Fear of the people. They're doing it at night. The people were asleep. And yet all these religious leaders and these courts and the Sanhedrin, they were all strangely awake and assembled and ready. And also when we read this and saw that Jesus was accused of several things. None of it was proven. All the accusations were bogus. They were false. They were flip-floppy depending on which leader they were in front of trying to convince. There were no witnesses. We hear a lot in our culture right now about trials and court trials and witnesses and evidence and all of that. There was no evidence. And he was not found guilty. He was declared guilty. And I found that absolutely profound. And then by 8 o'clock in the morning, he was being scourged. And then at 9 was when the actual, when he was actually nailed to the cross. It was about 9 in the morning. And that's a long, hard night. And I had the privilege about 2 years ago of being in the Holy Land, and we walked that path of Golgotha to see how far Jesus had to go. And I have to tell you, it was surprising how narrow the streets were. If it was as busy as it was for Passover and millions of people, thousands of people around, they would have all seen it. They would have seen Jesus coming through the streets with that cross, and they could have touched him. And where they actually put the cross, it was not up on some barren hill somewhere that you would see from afar. It was like right there in town, so close. It must have been so dramatic and so amazing. Again, like yesterday, to see that sacrificial lamb there on Passover weekend.
And all these things just kind of go right along through the time. And imagine that all these trials are taking place in the evening, in the stealthness that the Pharisees were trying to do. And then at 9 o'clock in the morning, as the people are coming to life for their new morning, that's when Jesus is being walked through the city. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, nailed to the cross, he's crucified there. It says at noon, that darkness fell over the land from noon until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is when Jesus died, when he declared, "It is finished." From there, he is then...
That's less than 24 hours.
Yeah.
Jesus goes from arrest to execution. That seems like a pretty speedy process.
And as we said, a train rolling down the tracks with nothing stopping it. So in 24 hours from his arrest to his execution, just a lot of things happen. And then after that, he is taken down off the cross by Joseph of Arimathea. And in keeping with the Jewish law, he needed to be off the cross and buried before sunset. And so all that takes place in this day that we've just covered. From sunset of the Passover feast, we've covered it all in about 6 or 7 minutes and talked about all these things. So what is our takeaway for this? I think the first one, I mentioned it already. Jesus, in his last moments, before he knew he would be arrested and put on trial and crucified, he spent this time teaching.
Kept his disciples close.
And kept his disciples close. He wanted his friends near. And he shared a lot of great things with them. Again, I think probably the most important one that we need to be reminded of is that they would love one another, because by this love, everyone would know that they were his disciples. And they did. They changed the world. And the fact that Jesus prayed for them, and prayed for us that we would be one and that we would take this love and we would share it. So that's my first takeaway. Our second takeaway is about the trials.
And the contrast too of the love Jesus was saying, love one another will show that you're mine. And the chief priests and all the ones that came against him, we didn't see any love there.
Right.
So just a full contrast. And then just this awful night of trial.
And the fact that there were false accusations. And so our takeaway for maybe for you and for me, I know maybe we've all been there at one point. We have been falsely accused.
We have had things come against us that have no bearing, and we could not defend ourselves. We went the way of Jesus and kept our mouths quiet, and it's hard.
And maybe you've been there, but I think the encouragement, the second takeaway was that as we've read before in reading the Bible, is that Jesus was tempted like we are, yet without sin. And so Jesus has been in that same boat that you and I have been, where he was unjustly accused. And so those are our two takeaways for today. Now we've come to all that. We've come to the crucifixion. And tonight, remember, 6 o'clock, either come live to meet at the church, or we're also going to live stream that. We're going to have our Good Friday service, and we'll talk a little bit more about the cross and the crucifixion.
We're going to have communion.
And we'll have communion together. It's going to be a really special evening, and we hope that you will join us this evening at 6 o'clock. And then we'll be back tomorrow to talk about what Saturday looked like. So thank you for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your day. We love doing this and hope you're enjoying this. Have a great rest of your day.